She cooked every dish on that table, salted the meat, rolled the dough, stirred the gravy from dawn until her arms ached. And when the family finally sat down to eat, they closed the door in her face. Mara Whitlock stood outside in the Wyoming wind, 37 years old, holding a tin plate like a beggar at her own feast. This is the story of a woman who gave everything and was left with nothing, until one stranger sat down beside her in the cold and changed the entire equation. If you've ever been overlooked by the people who are supposed to protect you, stay until the very end. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold came early to Redstone Crossing that year. By the second week of October, frost was already coating the fence posts each morning, and the sky had taken on that particular shade of gray that old-timers in the Wyoming territory recognized as a warning, not just of winter coming, but of the hard kind, the kind that didn't care whether you were ready. Mara Whitlock had been awake since 4 in the morning. She hadn't needed an alarm. She never did. Her body had long since trained itself to rise before the household stirred, before the fire needed feeding, before anyone could accuse her of sleeping while there was work to be done. She pulled on her heavy wool dress in the dark, the fabric smelling faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs, and made her way downstairs to the kitchen without lighting a lamp until she reached the stove. The Aldrich house was large by Redstone Crossing standards. 3 stories of rough-hewn timber and river stone, with a parlor that held an actual upholstered settee shipped in from Cheyenne, and dining room windows that faced east so the morning light came through in long amber strips. Harlan Aldrich had built it 22 years ago when he'd first struck water on the north pasture, and he'd never let anyone forget it. Mara had lived in that house for 31 of her 37 years. She'd been brought there as a child of 6 after both her parents died of fever within the same winter. Her mother first, then her father 3 weeks later, as though he simply couldn't see the point of continuing without her. Her grandmother, Eunice Whitlock, had been the one to arrange her placement with the Aldriches. Eunice being some distant relation to Harlan's first wife, the precise nature of the connection never made entirely clear to Mara. What was clear was the arrangement. Mara would have a roof and food. In exchange, she would help. Help had turned out to be a flexible word. By the time she was 9, she was washing laundry for a family of 5. By 12, she was doing most of the cooking. By the time she was old enough to have opinions about her situation, the Aldriches had already made her feel so thoroughly that she owed them everything. Her survival, her education, the very food in her stomach, that voicing those opinions felt something close to criminal. So she didn't voice them. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She hauled water and chopped kindling and put up preserves every fall and nursed whoever was sick through every winter. She learned to make herself small and useful simultaneously, which is a particular kind of exhausting that most people never have to understand. You're not invisible enough to be ignored. They need you too much for that. But you're not significant enough to be treated as a person. You exist in the in-between. That was Mara's life in the Aldrich house. The harvest feast was an annual tradition that Harlan took seriously. It dated back, he claimed, to the founding of the territory itself, though Mara suspected it dated back primarily to Harlan's own ego and his fondness for having people admire his property and his table. Every October, the family invited neighboring ranchers, a few merchants from town, the county land registrar whose name was Elwood Pruitt, and various relatives from as far as Laramie and Rock Springs. They ate and drank for an entire evening, and Harlan stood at the head of the table and talked about his land and his cattle and his plans with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no. This year's feast would be the largest in recent memory. Dorothea Aldrich, Harlan's wife, had been talking about it since August. 40 guests, she'd announced, perhaps 45. A proper roasted pig, 2 whole turkeys, venison stew, corn pudding, biscuits, 3 kinds of preserves, dried apple cake, and a custard tart that Dorothea had seen described in a magazine sent up from Denver and was insisting upon despite having never made it herself. The insisting, of course, was directed at Mara. "You'll figure it out," Dorothea had said, waving one hand dismissively while fanning herself with the magazine page. "You always do." That was the closest Dorothea ever came to a compliment. So Mara had spent 3 days preparing. She'd risen before 4 each morning, working through the pre-dawn hours while the household slept. She'd sourced the venison from the Callaway Ranch 2 miles east after Harlan's own hunting trip came up short. She'd rendered the lard herself, made the corn pudding from scratch twice because the first batch set wrong, and stayed up past midnight the night before perfecting the custard tart she'd never made in her life, based on a recipe description that left out half the relevant measurements. By the afternoon of the feast itself, the kitchen smelled extraordinary, rich and warm and layered, roasted meat and sweet corn and the sharp, clean scent of dried apple soaking in cider vinegar. 3 other women from the household had drifted in and out of the kitchen throughout the day, lifting lids and tasting things and offering opinions, but the actual work had been Mara's. It was always Mara's. She wiped her hands on her apron around 3 in the afternoon and allowed herself 1 full minute of standing still in the kitchen, looking at everything she'd made. It was a foolish thing, probably, a small vanity, but she let herself have it anyway. Then Dorothea swept in with her daughter Cecily behind her, both of them already dressed for the evening in fresh gowns, and began directing the arrangement of dishes onto serving platters without once looking at Mara directly. "The tart goes on the sideboard, not the main table," Dorothea said to Cecily. "And for heaven's sake, get Mara out of that apron before people start arriving. She looks like the kitchen help." Cecily laughed at this. Mara untied the apron. She'd put on her good dress that morning in a small act of hope, a slate blue wool she'd sewn herself 2 winters back, not fashionable by the standards of Dorothea's magazines, but clean and well made. She'd twisted her dark hair back neatly. She'd done what she could. The guests began arriving around 5. Mara answered the door 17 times before Dorothea stationed Cecily there instead, apparently having decided that Mara at the door was not the impression they wanted to make. Mara moved to the kitchen, kept the stove fed, made sure the coffee was hot, and the serving dishes were replenished. She moved through the crowded rooms quietly, navigating around conversations she wasn't part of, refilling things and replacing things and keeping everything running with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing exactly this for 2 decades. Nobody spoke to her directly for the first hour. That wasn't unusual. At these events, Mara existed as a kind of human furniture, functional, necessary, invisible. The guests who came every year had long since stopped registering her presence as anything worth acknowledging. The new ones sometimes glanced at her and then away quickly, having received some unspoken cue from the Aldriches about her status in the household. By 6 o'clock, all the food had been carried out and arranged. The table looked remarkable. Mara could admit that, even now, standing back against the kitchen doorframe and looking at it. The roasted pig at the center surrounded by sprigs of dried rosemary. The turkeys carved and fanned on the platter the way she'd seen illustrated in that same Denver magazine. The corn pudding in the cast iron, steaming. 3 kinds of preserves in the glass jars that caught the lamplight. The custard tart, improbable and golden, holding together perfectly on the sideboard. Harlan stood at the head of the table and looked at it all with satisfaction, the expression of a man surveying something he'd created. "Come on then," he said to the room, pulling out his chair. People began finding seats. The long table could hold 30 comfortably. This evening, chairs had been added at both ends and along one wall, and a second smaller table had been set up in the corner for the older children. It was crowded in the particular warm way of harvest celebrations, bodies pressing together, voices overlapping, the sound of wooden chair legs scraping on plank floors. Mara moved to find her usual seat, not at the main table, never at the main table during large gatherings, but at the small side table near the kitchen door where she typically ate with the household's elderly handyman Bert Coles, and occasionally one of the younger hired hands. It was a separate table, yes, but it was inside. It was near the warmth. It was something. Bert wasn't there tonight. He'd gone to his sister's in Laramie for the month. The small side table held a cluster of guest coats and a hat someone had left behind. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the full room and understood what was happening with the particular clarity of someone who has been quietly humiliated enough times to recognize the shape of it before it fully arrives. She went to Dorothea, who was seated and already lifting her fork. "Where would you like me to sit?" Mara asked, keeping her voice level. Dorothea glanced at her briefly. "You can take your supper in the kitchen." "The kitchen bench doesn't have a—" "Or outside," Dorothea said, already turning away. "It's not so cold tonight." This was not said cruelly, exactly. That was perhaps the most disorienting part. It was said the way you might note that the weather is acceptable for a short walk, as an observation, a practical solution to a minor inconvenience. Dorothea did not look at Mara when she said it, and she did not look at her afterward, because the matter was simply resolved. Mara stood there for 1 second, 2. Then she walked to the kitchen, filled a tin plate with food from the pots she'd been saving back. Not leftovers, but portions she'd set aside before the serving platters went out, a habit she'd developed years ago on instinct and never examined too closely. And she went outside. The cold hit her immediately. Not brutal cold, not yet. Dorothea hadn't been entirely wrong about that, but the kind that found the gaps in your clothing and settled there, patient as anything. The kind that in 2 more weeks would be genuinely dangerous. The porch wrapped around the back of the house, away from the main entrance where guests had arrived, and there was a single bench against the wall that caught some protection from the wind when it came from the north. Mara sat on the bench. She could hear them inside. The sound of it traveled through the walls with an eerie clarity. Laughter, the clink of glasses, Harlan's booming voice riding over everything else. She could smell her own food, the venison stew steaming faintly in the cold air, rising from the tin plate on her lap. She should eat. It would get cold quickly. She didn't eat. She sat with her hands around the plate for warmth and looked out at the dark field behind the Aldrich house, at the pale line of the fence and the darker shape of the barn beyond it, and she thought about nothing specific and everything at once in the way that the mind does when it finally stops performing okayness and allows itself a moment of honesty. 31 years. She'd been in that house for 31 years. She'd given more labor to that family than any hired hand they'd ever employed, for no wage, for the privilege of being fed and housed and kept in a state of perpetual obligation. She had sewn their clothes and raised their children. Cecily had been barely walking when Mara arrived, and she'd spent years chasing that girl around the yard, and now Cecily laughed from inside a warm dining room at a feast Mara had made and didn't once turn to wonder where Mara was sitting. The wind picked up briefly, finding the back of her neck, and Mara hunched forward over the plate. Inside, someone was telling a story that made the room erupt. She could feel the laughter in the soles of her feet through the porch boards. She should go back in. She could find a corner. She could make herself useful enough that it became awkward to exclude her. She'd done it before. She didn't move. There was something happening tonight that was different from the other times, some internal wire that had been bending slowly under strain for years and had finally, quietly, reached the edge of what it could hold. She wasn't sure what would happen when it gave way. She wasn't sure she was ready to find out. So she sat still and held the plate and watched the cold, dark field and waited. She didn't hear him approach. The first she knew of him was the sound of boots on the porch boards, unhurried, coming around from the far end, from the direction of the side gate rather than the back door. She turned and saw a man she didn't recognize, which was notable given how thoroughly she knew everyone in the surrounding territory. He was tall, broadly built without being heavy, wearing a coat that had seen real use rather than the dressed-up coats most men wore to events like this. He looked like someone who worked outdoors in all weather and had stopped caring about the evidence of it. He stopped when he saw her. Not the quick glance and continue that she was used to. He actually stopped, and he looked at her, at the tin plate, at the situation, with a kind of direct attention that felt almost aggressive in its contrast to what she'd experienced all evening. "You one of the Aldriches?" he asked. "No," Mara said. "Then what are you doing out here?" It was a blunt question, not unkind, just direct in the way of someone who'd grown up in places where plain speech was more useful than careful speech. She wasn't sure how to answer it, which was its own kind of strange sensation, because she'd had an answer ready for that question for 30 years. I live here, I work here, this is how it is. But for some reason, sitting on a cold porch bench with a tin plate going cold on her lap, the standard answer felt like a lie she was too tired to tell. "They didn't have room for me at the table," she said instead. He looked at her for a moment in a way that suggested he was deciding something. Then he turned and went back through the side gate. Mara turned back to face the field. She lifted her fork. She heard the back door open and close, and then she heard it open again, and then she heard boots on the porch boards again, and then the man was back. He was carrying a proper china plate, one of Dorothea's good ones that only came out for company, piled with food and a cup of coffee. and he sat down on the far end of the bench with the casual ease of someone choosing a seat at a lunch counter. He didn't look at her right away. He looked out at the same dark field she'd been staring at. "Cold out," he said. "Yes," Mara said. He picked up his fork and started eating. The sheer ordinariness of it was somehow the most destabilizing thing that had happened to her in years. She didn't know what to do with it. She sat there with her own fork poised over her tin plate and felt something in her chest that was dangerously close to cracking open, which was ridiculous. It was just a man sitting on a porch. It was just, "The venison's good," he said, chewing. "The gravy especially." "That your work?" "Most of it," she said. He nodded like that was the expected answer. They ate in silence for a short while, the kind of silence that was oddly easier than conversation would have been, the sounds from inside muffled and distant. "Gideon Vale," he said eventually, without turning. "I've got the Harmon spread about 4 miles north. Just completed the purchase in September." "Mara Whitlock. You've been with the Aldriches long?" 31 years. Something shifted in his expression. A slight recalibration, a quiet taking in of that information. "That's a long time," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The back door opened. Harlan Aldrich stepped onto the porch, and he stopped short when he saw the two of them sitting there, and the expression on his face was something Mara had never seen directed at her situation before. It wasn't embarrassment, exactly. Harlan didn't embarrass easily. It was something more like irritation, the look of a man whose tableau has been disrupted in a way he doesn't quite know how to address. "Vale," he said. "There you are. I've been looking to speak with you about the north fence line." Gideon Vale set down his coffee cup and looked at Harlan Aldrich with an unhurried patience that Mara found she had to stop herself from staring at. "I'll be in shortly," he said. "We're finishing supper." The "we" landed in the cold air between them like something solid. Harlan looked at Mara, looked back at Gideon. A small muscle worked in his jaw. "Of course," he said, and went back inside. Mara looked down at her plate. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," Gideon Vale said. "I ate outside because I wanted to, same as you." Which was, she suspected, not entirely true, but she didn't say so. She ate the last of her venison stew, and it was cold by then. But she didn't care because, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was sharing a table with someone who'd chosen to be at it. The wind came off the field in a long, slow gust that rattled the bare branches of the cottonwood at the fence line. Inside, the feast went on. Mara sat in the cold, and something inside her, some arrangement that had held itself rigid for decades, shifted by a single degree. Not enough to feel like change, not enough to feel like anything she could name yet, but a degree. She was up the next morning before 4, same as always. The house was quiet in the specific way it got after a large gathering. The silence of too many people having made too much noise, a kind of echoing absence. The dining room still held the wreckage of last night's feast, stacked plates, half-emptied bowls, the pleasant turned sour smell of food sitting out overnight. 3 of the guests had stayed over rather than ride home in the dark and were presumably still asleep upstairs. Mara built up the kitchen fire and started water for coffee and began the clearing. She worked her way through the dining room methodically, stacking and sorting, scraping plates into the slop bucket. The custard tart had been almost entirely consumed, which she noted with a small private satisfaction. She'd been worried about it until it held. It was somewhere around 5:30 when she found the document. It had fallen, or been placed, between 2 of Harlan's ledger books on the sideboard, half hidden by the corner of a tablecloth. It was folded and appeared to be some kind of official paper. She could see the seal at the top, the kind that county offices used. She should have left it. That would have been the sensible thing, the correct thing by every rule she'd been taught. Things in this house that weren't explicitly hers were not hers to examine. That had been made clear early and often. She unfolded it. She didn't understand all of it immediately. Legal language was not something she'd had reason to practice. But she understood enough. She understood the words property transfer, and she understood Eunice Whitlock, deceased, and she understood Mara Ann Whitlock, sole heir, and she understood the date, which was 15 years ago nearly to the month. She stood in the cold dining room with the document in her hands and read it again. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress. Then she went back to clearing the table, because the table needed clearing and because she needed to think. And thinking required the cover of ordinary activity. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of stacking and wiping and carrying, and her mind moved through something entirely different. 15 years. Her grandmother had been dead for 16 years. Mara had attended the funeral. Harlan had driven her himself in the wagon, an act of apparent generosity that she'd thanked him for. It had not occurred to her, not then, not in any of the 15 years since, that there might have been anything to inherit. Her grandmother had been an old woman with a small house and a worn-out garden. That was what Mara had believed. But the document in her pocket said something different. A farmhouse and 40 acres on the Sweetwater Road transferred by recorded deed to Mara Ann Whitlock. 15 years ago. A property she had never seen, never been told about, never once been allowed to know was hers. Outside, the first gray light was beginning to show at the horizon. Mara set a stack of plates in the wash basin and turned on the water and stood there with her hands in the cold water and let herself feel, very briefly, the full weight of what the document meant. Not the legal meaning. The other meaning. The shape of the last 15 years redrawn around a fact that had been kept from her. Then she heard Dorothea's step on the stairs, and she straightened and she began to wash the plates. She was careful that morning to keep her face ordinary. She was careful all day. She spoke when spoken to and answered questions and completed the work of clearing and washing and restoring the house to its usual order. And she did not once look at Harlan or Dorothea differently than she had looked at them the day before. But the document was in her pocket. She could feel the folded edge of it against her hip the entire day. And something that had been bending slowly for 31 years was very nearly done bending. She saw Gideon Vale 3 days later. Not by arrangement. She'd gone to Pruitt's office at the county registrar in town, telling Dorothea she was going for flour and thread, which was also true. She'd meant to ask Elwood Pruitt about the document quietly, to confirm what she thought she understood, to find out what it meant in practical terms, before she let herself believe it entirely. Pruitt wasn't in. His clerk, a nervous young man named Fessler, had told her to come back the following week. She was coming out of the registrar's office onto the main street of Redstone Crossing when she walked almost directly into Gideon Vale, who was coming out of the hardware store 3 doors down, carrying a coil of wire over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw her. He looked like a man who would remember a person he'd met, which she found she'd been wondering about. "Miss Whitlock?" he said. "Mr. Vale? Everything all right?" She almost said yes, the automatic response, the reflex. Then she stopped herself. "I'm not certain," she said. "I found something at the house, something I may need help understanding." He didn't press. He just looked at her with that same direct attention she'd noticed on the porch, the kind that didn't assume or rush. "I know a man who handles land records," he said. "Good man, straight. If you've got something you need looked at properly, he'd be the right person." "I went to Pruitt's office," she said. "Pruitt's the registrar," he said. "I'm talking about someone different. Someone whose first interest is yours." She wasn't sure what to make of that offer. She wasn't sure what to make of him, exactly. The ease he had, the lack of any apparent agenda. Men who were easy with her usually wanted something from it, but she was standing on a cold October street with a legal document in her coat pocket that she didn't fully understand, and she was running out of time before the Aldriches noticed she'd been gone too long. "All right," she said. "I'll send word when I've arranged it," he said. He shifted the coil of wire on his shoulder. "You did well with that custard tart. My compliments." Then he walked on. She stood on the street for a moment watching him go, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something adjacent to the possibility that things might be different. Not different yet. Not even close to different yet. But the possibility of it, like a match not yet struck. She bought the flour and the thread. She went home to the Aldrich house and cooked supper and cleared supper and washed the dishes by lamplight, same as every other night for 31 years. The document pressed against her hip through all of it. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay on her narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen, always the small room off the kitchen, never one of the upstairs rooms, even when they stood empty. And she looked at the dark ceiling and she thought about 40 acres and a farmhouse on the Sweetwater Road that had been hers for 15 years without her knowledge. She thought about her grandmother's hands, rough and warm, the particular way she'd cupped Mara's face when saying goodbye as a child. She thought about what it meant to trust someone with the safekeeping of your future and have them hand that future over to people who would lock it in a drawer. She thought about Gideon Vale sitting on a cold porch bench and eating supper and saying we like it cost him nothing. The match wasn't struck yet, but her hands had stopped shaking. The message from Gideon Vale came 4 days after their meeting on the street, delivered by a boy on a brown horse who handed Mara a folded note at the kitchen door and rode off before she could ask him anything. The note was brief and written in a plain hand that matched what she'd have guessed about him. No flourishes, no wasted words. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, Leland Marsh's office above the grain exchange. He's expecting you. GV. She read it twice, folded it into her apron pocket alongside a list of things Dorothea needed from the dry goods store, and went back to the bread she'd been working. Thursday was 2 days away. She didn't tell anyone about the note. She didn't tell anyone about the document either, which she'd moved from her dress pocket to the inside of her winter boot, folded flat against the inner sole, a hiding place she'd identified as a child when she'd had small things she needed to keep. The instinct had come back without her having to think about it. Those 2 days had a particular quality to them. The specific interior tension of someone carrying a secret that changes the shape of every ordinary thing around it. She washed dishes, and it was strange. She made breakfast, and it was strange. She sat through supper while Harlan talked about his plans for the spring pasture and looked at his face across the table and thought, "You knew," and kept eating. She didn't know that for certain. Not yet. The document could have come to him through any number of channels. But she knew the Aldrich household the way you know a house you've lived in for 31 years, its sounds, its rhythms, its particular patterns of behavior. And she knew that things which inconvenienced Harlan Aldrich had a way of disappearing quietly, and things which kept Mara useful and compliant had a way of being preserved. She wasn't making accusations in her own mind, not yet, but she was paying attention in a way she hadn't allowed herself to pay attention before. Wednesday evening, Dorothea asked her to press the parlor curtains. It was unnecessary work. The curtains didn't need pressing, and Mara recognized it as the kind of task that got assigned when Dorothea sensed some distraction in her, some failure to be fully present in her usual capacity. Dorothea had a talent for detecting withdrawal, the way some animals detect weather. She'd always used it to pull Mara back inside the orbit of the household's needs before any independent trajectory could form. "Of course," Mara said, and spent the evening pressing curtains by lamplight. She was not, she decided, going to let curtains stop her. Thursday morning, she woke at 4 as usual, started the fire, had breakfast ready by 6, and told Dorothea she'd be going to town for the dry goods list before the week got away from her. Dorothea, occupied with a letter she was composing to her sister in Rock Springs, waved one hand in absent approval without looking up. Mara put on her good coat and walked the 1.5 miles to town. The grain exchange building was on the eastern end of the main street, a solid 2-story structure that smelled of dried corn and dusty wood even from the outside staircase. The stairs ran up the exterior to a landing and a plain door with L. Marsh Land and Property Surveyor painted on the glass in careful black letters. Gideon Vale was already there when she arrived, standing on the landing with his hat in his hands and his coat collar up against the October wind. He nodded when he saw her coming up the stairs. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She was a little out of breath from the walk, more from nerves than the distance. "Is he?" "He's in. I told him about your situation in general terms. He's a good man, Mara. He won't take anything that isn't his to take." It was the first time he'd used her name without the formality, and she noticed it but let it pass without comment. Leland Marsh was 60 or thereabouts, with a white beard trimmed close, and the kind of careful, deliberate manner that comes either from genuine thoughtfulness or from years of practice at appearing that way. He had a desk covered in paper organized in some system Mara couldn't immediately read, and 2 chairs opposite it that didn't quite match, and a wall map of the county behind him with property lines drawn in red. He shook her hand when she came in, which she hadn't expected. "Miss Whitlock, sit down, please. Gideon tells me you have a document you'd like examined." She reached into her coat lining, she'd moved the paper there that morning, and set it on his desk. He unfolded it, read it, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he got up and went to a large filing cabinet in the corner and pulled open a drawer and spent some time with his fingers walking through papers. He pulled something out and brought it back to the desk and set it beside her document and looked between them. "This is the county deed record," he said. "Filed 15 years ago, August, exactly as your document states. Eunice Whitlock transferred the Sweetwater Road property. the Granger farmhouse, and 42 acres of surrounding land to her granddaughter, Mara Ann Whitlock, as sole heir. The deed was properly recorded and has never been challenged or reversed. He paused. That property is legally yours, Miss Whitlock. It has been for 15 years. The room was quiet. Mara looked at the two documents side by side on the desk and had the particular sensation of watching a wall come down that you hadn't known was there. It was never mentioned to me, she said. Her voice was very flat. Not once. Marsh looked at her with something careful in his expression. The deed is public record. It would have been accessible to anyone who went to the registrar's office and asked. I have to ask, were you ever told of your grandmother's passing wishes regarding property? I was told she died with nothing, Mara said. I was told her house was sold to pay debts. The Sweetwater Road property was not her primary residence, Marsh said. It was a separate holding, a farmhouse she'd owned for some years, in reasonable repair from what I understand, with pasture land and a small orchard. The value at time of transfer would have been considerable. He folded his hands on the desk. I'm not in a position to speak to what happened with the information regarding this property or why you weren't told, but the legal situation is straightforward. The property is yours. Gideon hadn't spoken during this exchange. He was sitting in the other chair with his hat resting on one knee, and when Mara glanced at him, he was looking at her with an attention that wasn't prying, but wasn't absent either. Like someone sitting with you through something hard, because sitting with people through hard things is what you do. What do I need to do to claim it? She asked. File an occupancy notice at the registrar's office, Marsh said. Given that you're the named heir on a properly recorded deed, no one can legally contest your ownership. The property has been sitting vacant, as far as my records show. There are no liens against it. And if the family that's been housing me objects? They have no legal standing, Marsh said, and his voice was quiet but clear. They are not on the deed. They have no claim. She sat with that for a moment. The concept of a thing being hers by right, regardless of what anyone else wanted, it was not a concept she had much practice with. It felt foreign in a way that was both uncomfortable and, underneath that, something warmer. How long would the filing take? She asked. I can have the occupancy notice drawn up this afternoon, Marsh said. If you come back tomorrow, it'll be ready for your signature. I'll walk you through what it means before you sign anything. She looked at him. Why are you helping me? It wasn't a suspicious question. It was a genuine one. He seemed to recognize that. Because someone should have told you 15 years ago, he said simply. And because Gideon asked me to, and I found Gideon Vale to have good judgment about which situations need attending to. She looked at Gideon again. He lifted one shoulder in a slight shrug, which was either modesty or discomfort with acknowledgement. She couldn't quite tell which. Thank you, she said to both of them. She walked back to the Aldrich house with the document reinstated in her coat lining and the weight of the visit settling through her in layers. On the surface was the practical information, the what and the how, and the timeline. Under that was something larger and less ordered, 15 years. She'd spent 15 years working in that house, not knowing she had somewhere else to go, not knowing she had something of her own. She tried to locate anger in herself and found it, but it was colder than she expected. Less like a fire and more like the frost on the fence posts every morning, a steady, patient presence that had been there all along and was only now being named. She got back to the house just after noon. Dorothea was in the parlor with Cecily, the two of them looking at fabric samples that had come in on the mail coach, new curtains, apparently, for the upstairs bedroom. Mara came through to the kitchen and began preparing the midday meal. She was cutting potatoes when Harlan came in. He didn't often come into the kitchen. It was a room he regarded as Mara's operational territory in the same way he regarded the barn as the hands' territory. Functional, necessary, not requiring his direct attention. When he did appear in the kitchen doorway, it usually meant something specific. You were in town this morning, he said. For the dry goods, she said. The list Dorothea gave me. Fessler at the registrar's office mentioned he saw you in the area. She kept cutting. I walked past his building, yes. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who is often uncertain of how to proceed in a conversation, and the fact that he seemed to be deciding something told her that Fessler had told him more than just that he'd seen her. Did you go in? Harlan asked. Pruitt wasn't in last week when I went, she said. I was checking whether he'd returned. And had he? No. Another pause. She focused on the potatoes. "What did you need at the registrar's office?" he asked. His voice was still measured, the tone of a man asking a reasonable question, but there was something under it now. She set down the knife and turned to face him, because some conversations required facing. "I had a question about county records," she said. "I'll likely need to go back." His expression shifted in a way that was hard to read and very informative simultaneously. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just received confirmation that his carrying days may be numbered. Not guilt, exactly. More like the calculation that follows the recognition of a changed situation. "Mara," he said, and stopped. She waited. He didn't continue. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her with the uncharacteristic uncertainty of someone whose leverage has shifted, who is trying to determine how much shifting has occurred without revealing how much he knows about the mechanism. "The potatoes will be late if I don't get back to them," she said. He left. She turned back to the cutting board and her hands were steady, which surprised her a little. She'd half expected them to shake. But they were steady, and she cut the rest of the potatoes, and when she put them on to cook, she stood at the stove and let the warmth of it come up against her face and thought, very deliberately, tomorrow. Sick. She went back to Marcia's office the following morning on the pretext of returning a borrowed preserving pot to a neighbor on that end of town. A detour that added 20 minutes to the walk, but provided cover that felt necessary. The occupancy notice was ready, as promised. Marsh walked her through every line before she signed it. "This formally establishes your intent to occupy and take possession of the property," he said. "Once this is filed, you have 30 days to take physical occupancy, meaning you need to be living there, or at minimum present and actively managing the property. After that, the legal protections are fully in force. And before you file it, there's nothing stopping someone from filing a competing claim, though given the state of the deed, such a claim would almost certainly fail. Still," he paused, "speed is not a bad idea." She signed the document with the pen he offered, and her signature looked exactly the same as it always did, which felt strange given how different everything was. "One more thing," Marsh said as she was folding her copy. "You should know that the property has been used. Not lived in, but used. Some of the outbuildings, and there's evidence of recent activity in the orchard. I'm not saying anyone has a competing claim, but it's worth going to look before you file, so you know what you're walking into." She nodded. She hadn't thought about the physical reality of the property yet, had been so focused on the legal and the emotional that the actual land, the actual house, had remained somewhat abstract. She needed to see it. Gideon Vale was outside on the landing when she came out. He'd been leaning against the railing, apparently watching the street below with no particular urgency, and he straightened when she appeared. "It's filed?" he asked. "Not yet. Tomorrow, when Marsh takes it to the registrar. But signed." She tucked the copy into her coat. "He says I should see the property before it's official." "I know the Sweetwater Road," he said. "I drove past the Granger place when I was surveying the area before I bought the Harmon spread. It's not in bad repair. Better than you might expect after 15 years standing empty." She looked at him. "Have you been by there recently?" He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "Why?" she asked. "Because when Marsh told me about your situation last week, I wanted to know what we were dealing with," he said, without apparent embarrassment at having been proactive on her behalf. "The farmhouse needs work, but it's sound. The roof is solid. There's a wood stove in the kitchen that functions. The orchard's been wild for years, but the trees are still there. Apple and cherry, by the looks of it. The pasture fencing needs attention." She stood on the landing in the October wind and looked at him. "You went and looked at my property without telling me." "I did," he said. "That's fairly presumptuous." "Yes," he said. "I know." She wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or grateful, and the uncertainty of it was its own form of information. She'd spent 31 years in a household where actions taken on her behalf were always leveraged against her later, always came attached to a debt. She kept waiting for the shape of that to emerge here. It hadn't yet. "What's the condition of the kitchen?" she asked. He blinked once, recalibrating to the practical question. "Dirty but functional. The hearth is in good shape. The range needs the flue cleared before you could use it safely. 2 windows in the main room have cracked glass that'll need replacing before winter." "How far from town?" "1.5 miles south on Sweetwater Road. Then a quarter mile on the property track, 2 miles in total from the main street. She thought, I need to see it. I can take you, he said. Tomorrow morning, if that works. She almost said that was unnecessary, that she could manage the walk, but she caught herself before the automatic refusal. She was going to have to get better at receiving help without treating it like a trap. That was going to take practice. Tomorrow morning, she said. They went the following day, a Friday, Mara having told Dorothea she was visiting Agnes Trout, who was down with a chest cold and needed company. Agnes Trout was in fact prone to chest colds and would not contradict the story if asked, which were the practical parameters Mara worked within. Gideon had a wagon and a steady-tempered bay horse named Kell, who had apparently been told that brisk October mornings were unremarkable. They went south from town in reasonable quiet, which Mara was grateful for. She wasn't in the mood for conversation that required her to perform any particular state of being. The property track off Sweetwater Road was narrow, almost overgrown with late-season grass pressing in from both sides, and the wagon moved slowly along it. The farmhouse came into view gradually. First the roof peak, then the full structure as the track curved around a stand of cottonwoods. She didn't know what she'd expected. Some ruin, maybe. Some collapsed monument to neglect that would require her to scale down her emerging sense of what this property might mean. But it wasn't a ruin. It was a house that had been left alone for 15 years and showed it. The paint entirely gone, the porch railing missing 2 balusters, dead climbing vines still clinging to the east wall, but it was intact. It was standing. The chimney was straight. The windows in front were dirty but unbroken. Gideon stopped the wagon and they got down. The front door was unlocked, which was either neglect or an absence of anything worth locking away. The interior smelled of closed air and old wood and something faintly animal, probably mice having used the place for years. But underneath all of that was the particular quality of a house that had been well built. The floors were solid under her feet. The ceiling didn't sag. The kitchen was at the back, large by the standards of houses she knew, with a stone hearth and a cast-iron range, and 2 windows that looked out onto what had been a kitchen garden, now a tangle of dead stems. Mara stood in the kitchen for a long time. Gideon didn't crowd her. He moved through the rest of the house slowly, checking things, window frames, floorboards, the stairs, with the quiet, systematic attention of someone doing an assessment, leaving her the kitchen because he seemed to understand without being told that the kitchen was where she needed to be. She put her hands on the cold iron of the range. It was an older model, good quality, the kind that had been made to last. She thought about what it would feel like to have this range firing, to have this room warm and smelling of something she'd made, to have the choice of who came through the front door and who didn't. She thought about Dorothea saying, or outside in the same tone she'd say, pass the salt. She thought about her grandmother's hands. It's good, she said when Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her voice came out a little rougher than she intended. It's better than I expected. The range needs the flue cleaned, he said. I wasn't wrong about that, but the firebox is intact. I know how to clean a flue. I assumed you did. She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his weight back against the frame, not quite in the room, not quite out of it, giving her the space without disappearing from it. Why are you doing this? She asked. Not suspicion, this time. Something more direct than that. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was deciding between a quick answer and a true one. I grew up with a woman who should have had better options, he said. My mother. She stayed in a situation that didn't deserve her because nobody helped her see there was a door. He paused. I'm not saying you're her or that your situation is the same. I'm just saying I know what it looks like when someone's been told so many times they can't leave that they've stopped looking for the door. She looked at him steadily. I found the door myself. You did, he said, without hesitation. I'm just offering to help carry things through it. She turned back to the range and was quiet for a while. The orchard, she said eventually. What's the condition of the trees? The shift back to practical ground seemed to be something he understood as necessary, because he went with it without comment. Overgrown but alive. Wild apple trees are hard to kill. You'd need to prune them hard in early spring to get any yield this coming year, but by the fall after that you'd have a real crop. She nodded slowly, her mind moving through the shape of things that could exist here. The range, the kitchen garden, the orchard, The dining room off the kitchen, larger than she'd expected, that would hold 8 tables comfortably, maybe 10 if you weren't precious about it. "I need to move quickly," she said. "Once the notice is filed, the Aldriches will know." "Marsh files tomorrow morning," he said. "It'll be public record by noon." "Then I need to be out of that house before noon." The silence that followed had weight in it. "Tonight?" he said. "Tonight," she said. "Or first light tomorrow before anyone's up." He didn't argue with her. He didn't tell her she was being hasty, or that she should take more time, or that there might be a more careful way to handle it. He just nodded once. "I can bring the wagon at 4 in the morning," he said, "if you can be at the road with your things." "I don't have much," she said. "That's fine." She took one more slow look around the kitchen, at the cold stone hearth, at the dirty windows, at the neglected garden beyond them, at all the raw material of something that had been waiting for her for 15 years. 4 o'clock, she said. The hours between returning to the Aldrich house and midnight were the longest she'd known in years. She cooked supper, served it, cleared it, washed up. She pressed the parlor curtains Dorothea had mentioned again, because not pressing them would signal something. She answered 2 questions about tomorrow's breakfast and confirmed that yes, she'd remembered to order more coffee from the dry goods store. She moved through the house with absolute ordinary precision, every action the same as it had been 10,000 times before, her face and manner carrying nothing that could be read. Around 9 in the evening, Harlan came out of his study and stood in the hallway for a while, and she could feel him watching her without looking up from her mending. He hadn't said anything further to her since the kitchen conversation, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the household. Some pressure had shifted, some tension that she couldn't see but could feel in the way she always felt things in that house, through her skin rather than her eyes. He went back into his study. At 10, she went to her room. She had one trunk, small, that had come with her from her parents' house as a child. She'd carried it into the Aldrich house at age 6 and never once considered that she might someday carry it out. She packed it quietly, taking only what was unambiguously hers: her clothes, her sewing things, the 3 books she owned, a small-handled pot she'd bought herself at the hardware store 2 winters back, the document from Marsh's office folded inside the largest book. She packed it all in less time than she'd expected, which told her something about the smallness of what she'd been allowed to accumulate. She sat on the edge of the cot after the trunk was packed and looked at the room. It was a room that had never been made comfortable, never been made hers in any real sense, and yet she'd slept in it for decades and knew every crack in its ceiling and every draft from its single window. Leaving it should have felt like nothing. She wasn't sure why it felt like something. Because leaving is the hard part, she decided. Not because the leaving is sad, but because it's the moment when you admit you should have left long ago, and that admission has a cost. She didn't sleep. At 3:30, she picked up the trunk and walked through the kitchen and out the back door into the dark. The air was cold and clear and smelled of the dried grass of the near pasture and wood smoke from some neighbor's chimney. She walked the 1/4 mile to the road with the trunk bumping against her leg, and she stood there in the dark at the turnoff with her breath showing white and her heart going harder than the walk warranted. Gideon's wagon came out of the dark at 4 o'clock, same as he'd said, Kel's hoofbeats muffled on the frost-stiff road. He stopped beside her and looked down from the box. He didn't say anything about the trunk, didn't ask questions, didn't make the moment into more than it was. He climbed down and lifted the trunk into the wagon bed himself. Then he climbed back up, and she climbed up beside him, and he turned Kel south toward Sweetwater Road, and they drove away from the Aldrich house in the dark without looking back. She didn't look back. She'd been looking back her whole life. At the family she'd lost at 6, at the life she might have had, at the choices she might have made if she'd known she had choices. She was done with the direction of it. She faced forward in the cold, dark wagon seat with her hands folded in her lap, and Gideon Vale beside her not saying anything, which was exactly right, and she watched the pale ribbon of road unroll ahead of them and thought about what it meant to be, for the first time in her adult life, on the way to somewhere that belonged to her. Kel's shoes struck the road steadily. The stars were still out, the sky not yet gray. They turned onto the property track, and the farmhouse appeared against the dark sky with the lamp Gideon had apparently left burning in the kitchen window, a small yellow rectangle of light in all that black. She looked at that light for a long moment. It was hers. The first morning at the farmhouse was not the clean beginning she might have imagined in weaker moments. She woke on a folded blanket on the kitchen floor because the bedroom upstairs had no furniture, and the cold came up through the floorboards in a way that made the kitchen, with its stone hearth and Gideon's lamp still burning low, the only sensible place to sleep. Her back ached. The blanket had shifted in the night, and one shoulder had been against bare wood for hours. She lay there in the pale early light coming through the dirty kitchen windows and took stock of where she was and what she had. She had a farmhouse in need of work. She had 42 acres of frozen November land. She had one trunk of clothes and 3 books and a handled pot and a legal document that said all of it was hers. She had no food in the house, no wood split for the stove, no water drawn, no lamp oil beyond what remained in the one Gideon had left, which wouldn't last past mid-morning. She got up. The cold was immediate and complete, the kind that lives in unheated rooms and settles into stone floors and doesn't move for anyone. She pulled her coat on over her dress and her boots on over her wool stockings, and she went outside to find the woodpile, which Gideon had mentioned was around the east side of the house. It was there. Not a generous stack, but enough. Someone had split and stacked it, reasonably recently by the look of the pale fresh ends. She carried 4 armloads inside and had the kitchen stove going inside 20 minutes. Then she went back out to find the well. The well was 50 feet behind the house, stone-lined and covered with a wooden cap that had swollen with moisture and required real effort to move. She drew 2 buckets and carried them back and set water to heat. This was the opening shape of the days that followed. Not dramatic, not revelatory, just the hard, plain work of making a place livable. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees. She cleared the flue on the range, a sooty, unpleasant job that left her face black to the hairline and sent a cascade of debris down into the firebox that she then had to clean out with a rag and her bare hands. She dragged the dead climbing vines off the east wall because they were working their way under the siding. She knocked the mouse nests out of the corners with a broom handle and set the 3 traps she'd bought from the hardware store in town. She bought provisions from Callaway's general store on her second day, walking the 2 miles into Redstone Crossing early in the morning and carrying back what she could manage in 2 loaded arms: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, a slab of cured pork, lamp oil, and a box of matches. The woman behind the counter at Callaway's, a wide-faced practical woman named Ruth Callaway, who had been running the store since her husband's back gave out, looked at Mara with the particular attention of someone noting a change in a familiar pattern. "You're not with the Aldriches anymore," Ruth said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Mara said. Ruth looked at her for a moment, then started tallying up the provisions without further comment. That was something Mara appreciated about Ruth Callaway. She registered information without requiring the story behind it. "I hear the Granger property sold," Ruth said, writing numbers in her ledger. "Changed hands," Mara said. "It's mine now." Ruth looked up briefly. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration, the reassigning of a known person to a new category. "Good for you," she said, and went back to her ledger. The total came to more than Mara had. She had some savings, years of small coins, gifts at Christmas that amounted to little individually, but had accumulated in a cracker tin she'd kept under the kitchen floor plank at the Aldrich house since she was 22. She'd retrieved the tin the morning she'd left, slipping it into the trunk while the house was still dark. She had $11.40. After the provisions, she had $8.12. She walked home with the provisions and thought about what $8 could do and what it couldn't. Gideon came by on the 3rd day. He arrived in the mid-afternoon with his wagon loaded, and when she came out onto the porch to see what he'd brought, she found a rope cot with a proper canvas base, a table, 2 chairs, a small lamp, a 20-pound bag of oats, and a dressed-out chicken hanging by its feet from the wagon's side rail. He carried everything inside with the efficiency of someone who'd planned the loads in advance and didn't want the fact of it made into a conversation. She stood in the kitchen and watched him bring in the second chair and said, "You didn't need to do all this?" "The cot was in my barn doing nothing," he said. "The chicken is from my yard. The oats were extra." He set the chair down. "The table and the lamp I bought. I'll admit to those." She looked at the table. It was plain pine, rough-surfaced, the kind sold at the hardware store for practical use rather than display. It was the right size for the kitchen. "I'll pay you back," she said. "When you're able to," he said. "No hurry." She wanted to argue with the no hurry on principle, because accepting things without a clear accounting of when they'd be repaid was something she'd been trained out of by years in the Aldrich house, where every favor came with a running tab she'd never be done paying. But she recognized that the training wasn't fair to Gideon, and she made herself leave it. "Have you heard anything from the Aldriches?" she asked. He sat down on one of the new chairs with the casual comfort of a man who'd been on his feet since dawn. "Harlan came by my place yesterday morning," she stilled. "What did he say?" "Asked if I'd had any dealings with you regarding the Granger property." Gideon looked at her steadily. "I told him I'd introduced you to Leland Marsh and that you'd found the deed situation entirely on your own initiative, which is true." And he was quiet for a while, which, with Harlan, usually means he's doing arithmetic. Gideon's voice was level, but there was something under it. "He said you had no business interfering with county records and that the property situation was a family matter." He used those words. He did. "A family matter," she repeated. "I told him it sounded like a legal matter to me," Gideon said. He didn't have much to say after that. She turned to the window and looked at the dead kitchen garden, the frost-hardened ground, the bare apple tree at the corner of what had been a kitchen garden once and could be again. Her hands were braced on the edge of the stone sink, and she was aware of the hardness of it under her palms. "He's going to come here," she said. "Probably. Or he'll send someone. Also possible." She turned back. "What would you do if you were in my position?" He considered it properly, which she appreciated. He didn't give the quick, reassuring answer. "I'd have Marsh write up a formal notice of possession," he said, "something with county seal on it that I could put on the front door and wave at anyone who came looking. And I'd establish myself here as visibly and quickly as possible. Talk to neighbors. Let people know you're on the property. The more people who see you here and know you're here, the harder it is to pretend otherwise." "That's practical," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said, without any pride in it, just as a fact. She made coffee because she had it now, and the stove was running, and they sat at the new pine table and drank it, and outside the late afternoon light came at a low angle through the dirty windows and lay in long strips across the floor. It was quiet in the particular way of houses that are coming back to life after long stillness. Not empty quiet, but something more like a held breath. "Tell me about your place," she said. "The Harmon spread." He looked at her briefly, a slight surprise at the subject change. 600 acres, good grass on the east pasture. The house needs work, but less than this one did when I bought it. I'm building the herd back up. The Harmons let it run down the last few years." "What made you come to Redstone Crossing?" He was quiet a moment. "My previous place was in Colorado. I had a partner there for 8 years. He decided to take a different direction." A pause. "He sold his half from under me, basically. Couldn't legally prevent it, but I couldn't afford to buy him out, so I sold my share and came north." His voice didn't carry bitterness exactly, but the shape of what it had cost him was there. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 2 years ago," he said. "I'm not sorry about where I landed." She looked at him across the plain pine table. She had spent 31 years in a house with people who spoke to her in the imperative. Do this, don't do that, go here, stay there. The experience of sitting across a table from someone who spoke to her as though her thoughts and responses had weight was strange in a way that she didn't know how to fully receive yet. It kept catching her off guard. She kept expecting the transaction underneath it to reveal itself. She supposed that would take time. The Aldriches came on the 6th day, not Harlan. Dorothea. Mara was outside at the woodpile, splitting kindling when the buggy came up the property track, and she knew before it stopped who was in it. She set down the hatchet but didn't put it down entirely, held it loosely at her side, and stood and waited. Dorothea stepped down from the buggy with the deliberate dignity of a woman who intended to be in control of the situation she was entering. She was dressed well, better than a casual visit warranted, which meant she'd planned the impression. She looked at the farmhouse, at the cleared porch, at the swept yard, and her expression went through something complicated that Mara watched without comment. "Mara," she said, "Mrs. Aldrich." Dorothea looked at her directly, which was more than she usually bothered with. "I hope you understand how upsetting this has been. For all of us. You leaving without a word in the night like a—" She stopped. "We were worried." "You knew where I was," Mara said. "The deed was filed." A brief tightening around Dorothea's eyes. "The deed is a complicated matter. Harlan is looking into it. It's not complicated, Mara said. It's my grandmother's property, transferred to me 15 years ago. It's straightforward. Your grandmother made that arrangement without consulting us. We had been providing for you for years at that point. There were obligations. I wasn't consulted either, Mara said. Her voice was steady. I didn't know it existed. No one told me. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. In that moment, Mara watched her face and saw something she hadn't expected to see. Not quite guilt, because Dorothea was not a woman who went easily to guilt, but something more like a reckoning with the gap between how she'd told herself the story and how the story appeared in daylight. You had everything you needed with us, Dorothea said, and the words had a slightly rehearsed quality, like she'd said them to herself in the mirror that morning. A home, meals, security. I had labor, Mara said. 31 years of it, for no wage and no choice. You always had a choice. I didn't know I had a deed, Mara said. Without knowing that, I had no choice. You made sure of that. The last sentence landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Dorothea's chin came up. I don't know what you're implying, she said. I'm not implying anything, Mara said. I'm saying it plainly. Someone in that house knew about this property and chose not to tell me. I'm not certain whether it was Harlan or you or both of you together, and I'm not currently in a position to prove it either way. But I know what happened, and you know what happened. Dorothea's composure held, but only just. Her hands were tight on her gloves. Cecily misses you, she said, which was either a true thing or a strategy or both. Mara looked at her. Cecily was 29 years old and hadn't spoken to Mara with any real warmth in at least a decade. But she didn't say that. I'm sure I'll see Cecily in town from time to time, she said. You can't manage this property alone, Dorothea said. You don't have the resources. You don't have… Mara, be reasonable. This is not practical. Come back, we can discuss… I'm not coming back, Mara said. The words came out without effort, without the weight she'd expected them to carry, just the simple truth of them. I'm not coming back, Dorothea. This is my home. I'll manage. Another silence. Dorothea looked at the house again, and then at Mara, and something in her expression shifted into something smaller and more genuine than anything she'd shown so far. Not softness, exactly. More like the exhaustion of a woman who has been performing a version of herself for so long that dropping the performance, even briefly, is its own kind of relief. You should have told us you were unhappy, she said. The sheer audacity of it, the extraordinary, breathtaking audacity of that sentence, stopped Mara cold for a moment. She looked at Dorothea Aldrich and felt 31 years in that look, felt the cold porch and the tin plate and the kitchen bench and the small room off the kitchen and the 10,000 small erosions of being told without words that she did not fully count as a person. You should have asked, Mara said quietly. Dorothea got back in the buggy. She didn't say goodbye. She turned the buggy on the property track and drove back toward the road without looking back. And Mara watched her go and stood for a while in the cold with the hatchet loose in her hand and the sky going gray overhead. Then she went back to splitting kindling because the wood box needed filling and the cold wasn't waiting on her feelings. Harlan came 3 days later and he did not come alone. He brought Elwood Pruitt with him. Mara saw the wagon from the kitchen window while she was making bread, and she stood very still for a moment when she recognized Pruitt's particular narrow figure beside Harlan's bulk. Then she wiped her hands on a cloth, went to the front door, and stepped out onto the porch before they'd reached the steps. Harlan, she said. Mr. Pruitt. Harlan had the expression of a man who'd organized his authority around him carefully before making this trip. He was wearing his town clothes, the black coat he wore to meetings and church, and he carried himself with the full projection of someone accustomed to doors opening before he knocked. Mara, he said, I need you to listen carefully. Elwood has looked into this deed situation, and there are questions about its validity. She crossed her arms. The cold was sharp, but she didn't go back inside. Holding the porch felt important. What questions? Pruitt cleared his throat. He was a small man with a careful quality to him, the kind of careful that could mean honesty or the appearance of it. The deed recording has some procedural irregularities, he said. The notarization is from a notary who was later found to have had some issues with his… Leland Marsh looked at the same deed, Mara said. He found it properly recorded. Marsh is a surveyor, not a registrar, Pruitt said. He knows property law. He knows surveying, Pruitt said, with a smile that didn't reach anything above his mouth. These are different things, Miss Whitlock. I'm the county registrar. My office has jurisdiction over deed validity questions. She looked at him steadily. And did Harlan come to your office, or did you come to his? The smile stayed where it was, but went rigid. I think we're getting off on the wrong foot here, Harlan said, stepping forward with the tone of a man reasonably managing an unreasonable situation. Nobody wants a dispute. We want to resolve this sensibly. You've been with us a long time, Mara, and I want to do right by you. We'd like to offer you a settlement. What kind of settlement? He named a figure. It was less than the property was worth, considerably less, but it was more than Mara had ever held at one time in her life. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who had calculated in advance exactly what sum would be large enough to seem generous, while small enough to be worth making. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Dorothea on the porch before, saying you should have told us you were unhappy, as though unhappiness were the problem and not the 15 years of deliberate concealment that had produced it. No, she said. Harlan's careful expression slipped a fraction. Mara, no, she said again. This property is mine. I'm not selling it and I'm not settling. If you have a legal challenge to the deed, file it with a court and I'll answer it there. You can't afford a lawyer, Harlan said. And there it was. The real shape of the conversation, finally revealed. The patience dropping away, the thing underneath showing itself. That's my concern, she said. I'm trying to help you avoid a mess, he said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to sound like reason itself. Think about this clearly. You're alone out here. You've got no money, no support, no way to work this land by yourself. What exactly is your plan, Mara? What are you going to do out here? She looked at him, and she looked at Pruitt standing slightly behind him with that rigid smile, and she thought about every time she'd been told in one form or another that she was not equipped for more than what she'd been given. I'm going to build something, she said. She went inside and closed the door. Tja, she heard Gideon's wagon before she saw it, same as always, and came to the porch while he was still coming up the track. He read her face when he got down. Harlan came, he said, and Pruitt. He came up the steps. What did they say? She told him the irregularities claim, the settlement offer, the threat about the lawyer. He listened without interrupting, which was something she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't fill in her sentences or redirect her toward conclusions. He just listened until she was done. Pruitt is Harlan's man, he said when she finished. Has been for years. Any irregularity claim he files will be his word against Marsh's, and Marsh has better standing. He paused. But Harlan's right that you'd need a lawyer if it goes to court. I know, she said. I can't afford one. I can, he said. She looked at him sharply. Not as a gift, he said immediately, understanding what the look meant. As a loan, with interest if you want interest, paid back when you're able. But I'm not going to sit here and let Harlan Aldrich run a property fraud because the person he defrauded can't match his legal resources. She was quiet for a moment. You keep doing that, she said. Doing what? Stepping in. I've been stepping in, he said. I won't pretend otherwise, but I'm not stepping in front of you. There's a difference. She stood with that for a moment, trying to locate the thing that kept making her resist. The deep-trained suspicion of any help extended, the conviction that something would be extracted in exchange. She could feel the old pattern wanting to apply itself here, wanting to find the hook in it. But she'd been watching him for 3 weeks, and the hook hadn't appeared. All right, she said. Alone. I'll write it down. Fair enough, he said. She made coffee and they sat at the pine table, and he told her about a lawyer in Cheyenne that Marsh had recommended, a man named Cutter, who had handled land disputes across the territory. She wrote down the name. Outside, the wind was picking up, moving through the bare apple trees with a dry, rattling sound. There's something else, Gideon said. What? Harlan went to the Calloway store yesterday afternoon. Ruth told me when I was in this morning. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He told 3 different people in the store that you'd taken documents from his house, that you'd stolen official records. The cold that went through her had nothing to do with the temperature. He's going to put that story out before I can put mine out, she said. That's my read. She looked at the table. This was the part she'd known was coming but hadn't quite let herself plan for. The active campaign, the rewriting of events in the public version before the true version could establish itself. It was what people with power did when they couldn't win directly. They moved the ground. "What do I do?" she asked. "Talk to people," he said. "Not defensively, not as if you're responding to him. Just let people know you're here, that the property is yours, that the deed is properly recorded. Let them draw their own conclusions when they hear Harlan's version." People have known Harlan longer than they've known me as anything but the Aldriches. She stopped. She didn't have a word for what she'd been to them. "Some of them," he said, "but some of them have known you as the woman who's made most of the food they've eaten at Aldrich gatherings for 20 years, and done it well. That's not nothing." She thought about Ruth Calloway saying "good for you" without requiring the story behind it. "You overestimate how much people notice the person doing the cooking," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but I noticed." She looked at him, and he was looking back at her steadily, and for a moment the ordinariness of the kitchen, the coffee, the pine table, the cold windows with the bare orchard beyond them, felt less like privation and more like the raw material of something real. "There's one more thing," she said. "Something I haven't told you yet." "All right." She stood up and went to the trunk in the bedroom. She had a proper cot now, even if the room was otherwise bare, and came back with the copy of the deed, the original document she'd found at the Aldrich house. She set it on the table and pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. "I read this more carefully last night," she said. "The property transfer. My grandmother's language." She waited while he read. "There." He read for a moment. His expression changed. "She knew," he said. "She knew," Mara said. The paragraph was a protection clause, written in her grandmother's formal and deliberate hand. Eunice Whitlock had been a careful woman, a woman who'd thought things through. The clause stated that the property was to be held in trust, not to be sold or settled in exchange for any prior obligation of care, support, or housing, until Mara Whitlock herself had full knowledge of the transfer and had freely chosen its disposition. Her grandmother had anticipated someone trying to use the property against Mara, had anticipated, specifically, the argument that the property should offset the cost of Mara's upbringing with the Aldriches, which was exactly the argument Harlan had been building toward. The clause didn't just protect the deed, it anticipated the mechanism of the theft. "She knew what she was leaving you with," Gideon said slowly. "And she knew who she was leaving you with." "She arranged my placement herself," Mara said. "She must have known what they were like. She had nowhere else to put me. I was 6, she was dying, and there weren't options, but she tried to protect what she could." Her voice was even, but only just. "She tried to make sure that one day I'd have something that was mine. And they buried it." The wind moved through the bare apple trees outside, that dry, rattling sound. "This clause makes Harlan's settlement offer legally impossible," Gideon said. "He can't frame it as an offset of care costs. Your grandmother specifically excluded that." "I know," Mara said. "I need Cutter to see this before we do anything else." "I'll write to him today," Gideon said. She sat back down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at the deed and thought about her grandmother. The rough, warm hands, the particular smell of lavender and cedar that had followed her everywhere. The last time Mara had seen her face, which had been across a crowded church hall, at some occasion she could no longer precisely recall. Her grandmother watching her from across the room with an expression that Mara had read at the time as simple old woman sorrow, but now reread entirely. She'd been trying to tell her something. Even then, across a crowded room, she'd been trying to find a way to tell her. "Mara," Gideon said. She looked up. His voice had shifted to something more careful. "I want to tell you something, and I want to say it plainly so there's no confusion about what I mean." She waited. "I know this isn't the time and I'm not making it into something it isn't," he said. "But I want you to know that whatever happens with Harlan and the deed and the lawyer, my being here isn't conditional on any of it. I'm not here because it's an interesting situation. I'm here because—" He stopped. Seemed to decide on honesty over elegance. "Because I sat on a cold porch next to you 3 weeks ago and decided you were someone worth knowing. That's the full extent of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it cost a person to say a true thing plainly, without the protection of indirection or implication. She thought about how rarely anyone had said a plain true thing to her in her life. "I know," she said quietly. "I think I've known for a while." He nodded once as the conversation moved back to the letter he'd write. The name Cutter, the timeline, the practical architecture of what had to happen next. But something had shifted in the room in a way that wasn't undone by the returning to practicalities. Something had been said and heard, and it stayed in the air between them like the warmth from the stove. Not dramatic, not resolved into anything, just present. Outside, the cold held everything in its long November grip. The apple trees moved in the wind. Inside, the lamp burned on the pine table, and Mara Whitlock was in her kitchen, on her land, and she was not eating outside in the cold, and she was not alone, and for the first time in 31 years she had a fight on her hands that she'd chosen to have. She found, to her own considerable surprise, that she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. The letter to Cutter went out on a Tuesday, carried by the mail coach to Cheyenne, and the waiting that followed was the hardest part of that first month at the farmhouse. Not because Mara was idle. She was never idle. Idleness was a luxury she'd never developed a taste for, and in any case, the farmhouse didn't permit it. There was always something that needed doing, some repair or clearing or hauling that announced itself each morning with the particular insistence of a house that had been neglected for 15 years and was now being asked to serve again. She rechinked the gaps in the kitchen wall where the cold came through in thin, whistling streams. She got the range flue properly clear and fired it for the first time, standing back with genuine anxiety the first few minutes until it drew cleanly and the smoke went up the way it was supposed to. She scrubbed the bedroom floor until the wood showed its original color, a warm honey pine that surprised her with its quality. She fixed the 2 broken porch balusters with wood she found in the barn, cut to length and fitted in with a precision that Gideon, when he saw it, looked at with something like respect. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked. "Harlan's porch needed work about 8 years ago," she said. "He didn't want to pay anyone." He didn't say anything to that, but something moved across his face. The hard part of the waiting wasn't the work then. It was the uncertainty that lived underneath everything else. The knowledge that Harlan was moving pieces on a board she couldn't fully see, that Pruitt's cooperation gave him access to machinery she didn't understand, that the legal protection she'd felt reading her grandmother's protection clause might prove less solid in practice than it appeared on paper. She'd grown up watching the Aldrich family navigate the county's systems, knew how Harlan knew which men to talk to and which conversations happened in offices and which happened in back rooms, and how the 2 kinds of conversation produced different outcomes for different kinds of people. She wasn't naive about which kind of person she'd always been. The story about the stolen documents was spreading. She heard it from Ruth Calloway on her next supply run. Ruth saying it plainly, without editorializing, because that was Ruth's way of handling information she thought you needed. 3 people had mentioned it to Ruth in the past week. A variation of it had apparently reached the Presbyterian Ladies' Circle, which in Redstone Crossing was essentially the town's newspaper. "What are they saying exactly?" Mara asked. "That you took official papers from the Aldrich house when you left in the night," Ruth said. "Harlan's telling it that the papers belonged to him and that you had no right to them." "They were my grandmother's deed records," Mara said, "with my name on them." "I know that," Ruth said. "I'm telling you what he's saying." Mara bought her supplies. At the door, Ruth said, without turning around, "Agnes Trout's been asking about you. Says she'd like to call if you're receiving." "Tell her she's welcome anytime," Mara said. Agnes Trout arrived 2 days later on a gray horse that matched the November sky and had the look of an animal that had made its own decisions for some years. Agnes was 64 and had been widowed twice and had the particular freedom that sometimes comes to women who have outlasted the structures that contained them. She looked at the farmhouse with frank assessment, same as Ruth had, the recategorization happening visibly. "You've done a lot in 3 weeks," she said. "There was a lot to do," Mara said. "Come in." Agnes sat at the pine table and drank coffee and looked around the kitchen with the eye of someone doing a professional evaluation, which in some sense she was. Agnes had run the only rooming house in Redstone Crossing for 12 years before selling it to move to her daughter's property. She knew what made a place work. "You're thinking about cooking for people," Agnes said. It wasn't a question. Mara looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way you keep looking at that range," Agnes said. "Like it's a possibility." Mara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "The dining room is a good size. The range can handle volume if the flue stays clear. I know how to cook for crowds." "You know how to cook for crowds who were eating your food while you stood outside," Agnes said, with no particular heat in it, just the flat accuracy of a woman who'd been watching the social landscape of Redstone Crossing for decades. "The Aldriches are going to make things difficult for you if you try to open a business here." "I know. Harlan has friends." "I know that too." Agnes was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "I have $40 in the Bank of Redstone Crossing that I've been trying to decide what to do with," she said. "Elsa, my daughter, doesn't need it. I don't need it. I've been looking for something worth putting it toward." Mara looked at her. "I'm not making a charity offer," Agnes said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. I want a return on it. Modest, but real." "I don't have anything open yet," Mara said. "I don't even know if it would work." "I know you can cook," Agnes said. "I ate your venison stew through the Aldrich kitchen door twice, because Dorothea owed me a favor, and the favor was always expressed in food. And I know there's not a decent place to eat in this town between Calloway's counter and the saloon." She paused. "I'm not saying it won't be hard. I'm saying it might be worth trying." This was the way things moved in that first month. Not dramatically, not in large gestures, but in small, decisive increments. Agnes's $40. Ruth Calloway letting it be known around the dry goods counter that the Granger property deed situation was straightforward and recorded, and that the story about stolen documents was not a story worth repeating. Gideon showing up on a Saturday with 2 men from his ranch who spent the day fixing the east pasture fencing without being asked to, which was the kind of thing that made her throat tighten in a way she wasn't entirely prepared to deal with. She didn't always receive help gracefully. She knew that. She caught herself being short with Gideon twice when he made suggestions about the property that she hadn't asked for, suggestions that were usually correct and reasonable and still landed wrong because she was calibrating, still adjusting to the difference between help that comes free and help that doesn't. He took the sharpness without getting sharp back, which either meant he had remarkable patience or he understood the source of it, and she suspected the latter. The letter from Cutter arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Gideon had sent it. She read it standing at the kitchen window in the afternoon light. It was 2 pages, dense with legal language she had to work through slowly, but the substance of it was clear enough. Cutter had reviewed the deed and the protection clause and Pruitt's stated irregularity claim, and his assessment was direct. The deed was valid, the clause was enforceable, and Pruitt's irregularity argument was without legal foundation. The notary whose credentials had supposedly been questioned had in fact died in good standing, and the questions about his practice had been raised by Pruitt himself, apparently without any supporting documentation, only 2 weeks ago, meaning after Mara had filed the occupancy notice. Cutter's language at the end of the letter was measured but clear. The timing and nature of the registrar's challenge suggests coordinated action to obstruct a legitimate property claim rather than a good faith procedural concern. I would advise moving quickly toward a formal hearing if Mr. Aldrich presses his claim. In the meantime, the occupant's rights under the recorded deed remain fully intact. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and stood for a while without moving. Gideon came by that afternoon, as he often did in the late afternoon when the day's ranch work was done, and she handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it at the pine table with his hat still on and his coat still buttoned. "Pruitt invented the irregularity," he said when he was done. "After I filed," she said. "Not before." He set the letter down. He looked at it for a moment. "Harlan's been doing business with Pruitt for a long time," he said. "Property assessments, deed adjustments. Pruitt's handled a lot of things for him over the years." "Things like this?" "I don't know, maybe." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a man in Laramie, a territorial inspector, handles county officer misconduct. I know his name. I don't know if now's the time to bring him in." "What would be the right time?" she asked. "When you have more than one incident," he said. "Right now you have Pruitt making a claim that has no documentation. That's enough to beat him in a property hearing, but for misconduct you'd need a pattern." She thought about that. "Are there other cases?" He looked at her steadily. "That's a question worth asking." She went back to Leland Marsh the next morning and asked him exactly that question. She didn't frame it in terms of her own situation. She asked him, as a property surveyor who dealt with the county registrar's office regularly, whether he'd ever encountered inconsistencies in the way Pruitt handled deed challenges. Marsh was quiet for a long time. "Sit down," he said. She sat. 3 years ago, he said carefully, a widow named Clara Petch had a land dispute with her brother-in-law. The brother-in-law had a relationship with Pruitt. Clara's deed had a challenge raised that I looked at afterward and could not understand the legal basis for. She settled, sold for considerably less than the property was worth, because she couldn't afford the fight. Were there others? Another long pause. 2 that I know of directly, probably more that I don't. Would Clara Petch talk to someone? She might, Marsh said. She's still bitter about it. Bitterness and 2 years of distance sometimes makes people willing to speak when they weren't before. She wrote down Clara Petch's name and address in the small notebook she'd started keeping since leaving the Aldrich house. A habit she'd never had before, writing things down, because there'd never been anything that needed recording that was hers to record. Now there was. She wrote down everything. She was walking back along the main street when she saw Cecily. Harlan's daughter was coming out of the millinery, and they nearly walked into each other at the door. There was a moment of mutual stillness, the kind that happens when 2 people have to decide very quickly what kind of encounter this is going to be. Cecily was 29 and looked like her mother. The same strong bone structure, the same quality of presence that insisted on attention. She was well dressed, as always, her coat one of the better ones that had come through Calloway's this season. She looked at Mara with an expression that was hard to read precisely. "Mara," she said. "Cecily." A pause. The October cold moved between them. "You look well," Cecily said, and Mara could hear her trying to find the right footing for the conversation, which meant she'd thought about this possibility before now. "I'm managing," Mara said. Cecily looked at something past Mara's shoulder for a moment. "Father is very angry," she said, dropping her voice. "I want you to know that I—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't know. About the deed. I want to say that plainly. I didn't know it existed." Mara looked at her. She believed her, she found. Cecily had always been careless with Mara in the way of someone who'd never been made to think carefully about her, but she didn't have her father's capacity for sustained deception. "Did your mother know?" Mara asked. Cecily's eyes shifted. "I don't know," she said, which meant probably yes. "I believe you," Mara said, "that you didn't know." Something in Cecily seemed to loosen slightly, some bracing against an anticipated blow. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Keep the property," Mara said. "Everything else follows from that. Father won't let it go easily." "I know," Mara said, "but it's not his to let go of. It's mine to hold." Cecily looked at her for a moment in a way that was different from how she'd looked at Mara for the previous 20 years, less like furniture, more like a person she was seeing for the first time through the correct lens. It was a small thing. It didn't undo anything. But Mara noted it. "I'm sorry," Cecily said quietly, "for how things were." The apology was incomplete, couldn't possibly account for what it was apologizing for, but it was real, and Mara could feel the reality of it. "I know," she said. She didn't say it's all right because it wasn't, and they both knew it. She said, "I'll see you around town, Cecily," and walked on. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, the particular shape of Cecily's apology, what it contained and what it left out, the gap between what a person does and what they're willing to claim responsibility for. She didn't feel triumph about it. She didn't feel much of anything clear-edged. What she felt was something more complicated. The recognition that the people who'd harmed her were people, with their own incomplete understandings of what they'd done, and that there was no version of this story in which everyone would be fully accountable and she would be fully understood and everything would be balanced out. That wasn't how it went. She'd have to build something good without waiting for a reckoning that might never come in the form she needed. She was thinking about this when she got back to the farmhouse and found Harlan sitting on her porch. He was alone this time. No Pruitt, no performance of authority assembled around him. Just Harlan Aldrich in his black coat, sitting on her porch steps in the cold afternoon light, like a man who'd been there a while and had decided that waiting was worth something. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at him. He was 61 years old, and she'd never quite registered his age before in the way she registered it now. The gray at his temples, the loosening at his jaw, the way the cold seemed to be getting to him more than it used to. He was still a large man, still carried his authority as though it were physical mass. but something had shifted in the composition of it. "I'd ask you inside," she said, "but I'd rather say whatever this is out here." He looked at her for a moment. "Fair enough," he said, and the absence of his usual overriding confidence was more unsettling than his confidence would have been. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the bare apple trees. "I'm not going to pretend the deed situation was handled well," he said finally. "Your grandmother approached me about the property when she knew she was dying. She wanted to leave it to you directly, but she was worried about it being mismanaged, lost. She thought if she left it in my care until you were old enough to—" "She left it directly to me in the deed," Mara said. "Her name and mine. That's what the document says." "I know what the document says." "Then what are you telling me?" He shifted on the step. "I'm telling you that it was a complicated situation and that my intention was never to permanently deprive you, but—" "You had 15 years to tell me," she said. 15 years, Harlan. If your intention was to hold it until I was old enough, I've been old enough since I was 22. What was the reason then? Or at 30? Or when my grandmother had been gone 10 years and I was still sleeping in the room off the kitchen with no wage and no choices?" He was quiet. "What was the reason?" she asked again. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the plain question, asked plainly in the cold air between them. He looked at his hands. "It was useful," he said, and she heard in those 3 words more honesty than she'd expected from him. Not the full accounting, not the remorse she might have wanted, just the bare fact of it, stripped of justification. It was useful. Having her there. Having her compliant and dependent and not knowing she had somewhere else to go. It was useful. She stood with that for a moment. "Get off my porch," she said. He stood. He was bigger than her and had been the central authority of her world for 31 years, and she was standing on a cold November porch telling him to leave, and her voice was completely steady. "Cutter's letter makes it clear where the legal situation stands," she said. "File whatever challenge you want to file. I'll answer it, but don't come here again." He looked at her one more time, and she saw in his face something she'd never expected to see there. Not quite shame, but its structural neighbor. The look of a man confronting the sum of a series of small decisions that had always seemed individually manageable, and now, assembled in front of him in the form of a woman with her ground under her feet, added up to something he couldn't easily make peace with. He walked to his horse, untied it from the fence post, mounted, and rode back down the property track without looking back. She stood on the porch until he was gone. Then she went inside and sat down at the pine table and put her face in her hands and stayed there for a long time. Not crying exactly, just absorbing what had happened in all its layers. The confrontation, the admission, the fact that she'd held her ground, the fact that he'd gone. It wasn't victory. It wasn't resolution. It was something more like the first true breath after years of shallow breathing, the body's delayed recognition of what it had been doing to get by. After a while, she got up and built up the stove and started supper. The formal hearing was set for the 3rd week of December. Cutter came up from Cheyenne on the mail coach 2 days before, a compact, precise man of 50 with a clerk's neat appearance that disguised, Gideon had warned her, a legal mind of considerable force. He arrived at the farmhouse on the afternoon of his first day in Redstone Crossing and spent 2 hours with Mara at the pine table going through every document she had, asking questions in a rapid, systematic way that she answered as carefully as she could. When they were done, he looked at the stack of papers and said, "The protection clause alone wins this, but it's good that you have the timeline of Pruitt's challenge. It establishes bad faith." "Will that help with the other cases?" she asked. "Clara Petch and the others?" He looked up. "You've been doing your own work." "I went to talk to Clara Petch," she said. "She's willing to speak to the territorial inspector. She has her paperwork." Cutter looked at her with an expression of genuine recalibration. "How many others?" "2 that Marsh knows directly," she said. "I talked to one of them. She'd prefer not to be named publicly, but will provide a written statement." He nodded slowly. "That's a different case than a property hearing," he said. "That's an officer misconduct case, potentially removal from office." "I know," she said. "Is that separate from my hearing?" "It can run parallel," he said. "Your hearing resolves your property situation. The inspector case resolves Pruitt's." He paused. "You understand that pursuing both simultaneously creates more exposure for you, Harlan will fight harder if he thinks his man is under investigation. He's already fighting hard, she said. I don't think holding back changes that. Cutter looked at her for a moment in the way that some people looked at her lately, with the small adjustment of someone resetting their expectations. No, he said. I don't think it does either. The days before the hearing were not peaceful. Harlan filed 2 additional challenges to the deed, one questioning the original transfer documentation and one raising a claim of constructive abandonment, arguing that the property had been effectively abandoned for 15 years. Both were thin. Cutter dispatched them in written responses that Mara read carefully, learning the language of it, the specific leverage points where legal argument met recorded fact, and one of them had to give. The constructive abandonment claim in particular required a response that demonstrated she was actively occupying the property, and Cutter had her put together a record: the dated receipts from her supply runs at Calloway's, Agnes's written account of her visit, Gideon's testimony about the work done on the fencing, the receipt from the hardware store for the window glass she'd replaced. The ordinary details of building a life assembled as evidence that the life was being built. She found it strange and oddly appropriate that the ordinary daily work of surviving in a place could serve as its own legal defense. Every piece of firewood split, every cracked window replaced, every meal cooked on that range was part of the record of her presence. She'd always known that work was how you proved your worth to other people. This was the first time the proof ran in the opposite direction, work proving that this was hers, that she was here, that she intended to stay. Gideon was at the farmhouse the evening before the hearing when the stovepipe started leaking smoke. It wasn't catastrophic. A joint in the middle section had worked loose over weeks of thermal expansion, and the smoke was coming through in a thin stream that smelled wrong before it became visible. But it needed immediate attention, and Mara discovered it at 7 in the evening while she was heating supper. And her first response was a kind of furious despair that she was not proud of. She stood in the smoky kitchen and felt the accumulated weight of the past 6 weeks, and the hearing tomorrow, and the money she didn't have, and the work that kept coming regardless. And she put both fists on the cold stone counter and stood there with her eyes closed for about 10 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and found Gideon already pulling the stovepipe section down. She hadn't heard him come in. The door had been unlocked. I saw the smoke from outside, he said, without turning. He had the joint in his hand, examining it. The collar's warped. I've got a replacement piece in the wagon. I've been carrying spare pipe joints since September because mine did the same thing. She watched him work. The ease of it, the competence, the complete absence of any need for acknowledgement or thanks in how he did things. He fit the replacement joint and tested the seal and had the stovepipe reassembled in 15 minutes. And then he looked at the smoky air in the kitchen and opened both windows briefly to clear it, and the cold came in and took the smoke out. You should eat something, he said. The hearing's at 9. I know when it is, she said. But she sat down. He warmed the supper she'd been preparing and brought 2 bowls to the table, and they ate. And outside the December dark pressed against the windows, and the stove ticked as it heated up again. And she found, sitting there, that she was steadier than she'd expected to be. Are you ready? He asked. She thought about the question honestly. She thought about standing in a room with Harlan and Pruitt and a territorial judge while Cutter made the case that had been hers all along. She thought about what it would mean to win and what it would mean if something went wrong and they didn't. I've been ready since I found that document on the sideboard, she said. I just didn't know it then. He looked at her across the table. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, you've already done the harder thing. She looked back at him. What's the harder thing? Deciding the life you'd been given wasn't the one you had to keep, he said. She held that for a moment. Outside, the December wind moved through the bare apple trees, the same dry, rattling sound she'd been hearing since October. She was used to it now. It had become the sound of the property to her, the signature of it, the particular music of this piece of land. In the spring, those trees would need hard pruning. By fall, they might produce something worth harvesting. She thought about this dining room off the kitchen, the good-sized room she'd been imagining tables in since her first week here. She thought about Agnes Trout's $40 and what could be done with it and what would need to come first. She thought about the women she'd spoken to, Clara Petch, the unnamed woman who'd provided a written statement, and what it had meant to each of them to have someone ask the question. She thought about her grandmother's hands and the deed and the protection clause that had been waiting 15 years for her to find it. "The trees will be ready to prune by March," she said. Gideon was quiet for a moment, following the shift. "I can help with that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll let you." The stove ticked steadily. The windows were dark. The hearing was 9 hours away, and there was nothing more to do tonight but rest and be ready. She cleared the bowls and washed them at the stone sink, and felt the cold water over her hands and looked out at the black square of kitchen garden window and thought, tomorrow. The same words she'd said to herself in the Aldrich kitchen 2 months ago, holding a document pressed against her hip. Tomorrow had come, and come again, and kept coming. She was still here for every one of them. The hearing was held in the county courthouse on a Thursday morning, in a room that smelled of old paper and wood oil and the particular cold of a building that had been heated only recently and not thoroughly enough. Judge Warren Aldred presided, a man Mara had seen around Redstone Crossing over the years without ever having direct cause to speak to, a lean, deliberate man in his late 50s who had the reputation of taking longer to decide things than most people wanted, but almost never being wrong when he did. Cutter had said this was good for them. A careful judge means the record matters. The record is yours. Harlan was there with his own lawyer, a man from Laramie named Sauce, who wore a better coat than Cutter and had the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had won arguments through presentation before. Pruitt sat in the gallery, not at the table, which Mara noted. He'd been careful enough to keep some distance between himself and Harlan's formal proceeding. Gideon sat in the gallery as well, 3 rows back, his hat in his lap. He'd asked her that morning if she wanted him there, and she'd said yes without the usual beat of hesitation, which she recognized as its own small progress. Cutter laid out the case in exactly the order he'd walked her through at the pine table. The deed, the recording date, the protection clause, the timeline of Pruitt's irregularity claim. He was precise and unhurried and used exactly as many words as he needed and no more. Mara sat beside him and kept her hands flat on the table and her face still. Sauce made the abandonment argument with more fluency than it deserved. He had a way of making thin things sound dense, of filling space with language that felt substantial until you pressed on it. Judge Aldred pressed on it. "Counsel," Aldred said, interrupting Sauce mid-sentence, "are you arguing that Miss Whitlock abandoned a property she demonstrably did not know she possessed?" A pause. "Your Honor, the legal definition of abandonment does not require—" "Answer the question I asked," Aldred said. Sauce answered it, and the answer was yes, essentially, that was the argument. Aldred made a note. His expression communicated nothing, Harlan testified. He sat in the witness chair with his authority arranged around him, and told his version of the story in the measured tone of a reasonable man explaining a complicated situation to someone who might not have all the context. He said Eunice Whitlock had asked him to manage the property. He said the intention had always been to transfer it to Mara when the time was appropriate. He said the situation had grown complicated over the years, and he regretted that it hadn't been handled better. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he'd been wrong. The regret was structural, the regret of a man who regrets that circumstances produced a bad outcome, not the regret of a man who regrets his choices. Cutter cross-examined him with a single question. "Mr. Aldrich, can you produce any document, any letter, any recorded agreement, any written instrument of any kind that establishes that Eunice Whitlock asked you to manage this property on her granddaughter's behalf?" Harlan looked at Sauce. Sauce looked at his papers. "No," Harlan said. "Thank you," Cutter said. "No further questions." Aldred took 20 minutes. He came back into the room and sat down and looked at his notes and said, in the same unhurried, deliberate way he did everything, that the deed was valid, the protection clause was enforceable, the abandonment claim had no legal foundation, and the property belonged to Mara Ann Whitlock. He further noted, without elaborating, that the timing of the registrar's irregularity claim was inconsistent with good faith procedural practice, and that he was forwarding his observation to the territorial inspector's office. He said it all, and then he was done and left the room. Mara sat very still for a moment. Cutter put his papers in order without rushing, the practiced calm of a man who'd been in enough of these rooms to know that the moment after a decision lands is not the moment for motion. "It's yours," he said quietly. She knew it was hers. She'd known it was hers for 2 months. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and having a room full of people and a judge's voice confirm it, and the difference hit her in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. a loosening somewhere deep in the chest, behind the sternum, in the place where she'd been holding herself braced for a very long time. She heard Harlan's chair scrape. She didn't turn to look. She looked at the window instead, the courthouse window, winter gray outside, the bare cottonwood at the corner of the building moving in the December wind. She thought about her grandmother writing that protection clause in careful, deliberate script, trying to build a wall around the future of a 6-year-old girl she was dying and leaving behind. She thought about what it costs a person to try to protect someone they won't be there to protect. I found it, she thought, to no one and everyone. It took 15 years, but I found it. Gideon was beside her when she stood. He didn't say anything, didn't make it into a speech, just fell into step with her as she walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air, and they stood on the steps for a moment in the pale winter sun that wasn't warm enough to matter but was present, at least. That counted. "Pruitt's finished," he said, Aldred forwarding his notes to the inspector. "That's the beginning of the end of his tenure." "Clara Petch will be glad to hear it," she said. "You should tell her yourself," he said. "She'll want to hear it from you." She would. She made a note of that. They walked back to the farmhouse together, the 2-mile walk that she'd made dozens of times in the past 2 months. And the land looked the same as it always did. Frozen brown fields, pale sky, the bare tree line along Sweetwater Road. But the walk felt different. She couldn't have explained the difference to anyone who hadn't spent 31 years not knowing they had somewhere to go. The land wasn't prettier. The cold wasn't warmer. She just knew where she was walking toward, and it was hers. And that changed everything about the act of walking. The dining house opened in April. Not by plan exactly. The plan had been May, possibly June, when the kitchen garden might be producing and the worst of the mud season would be past, and she'd have a little more in reserve to weather the uncertain early weeks. But Agnes Trout told 3 people, and those 3 people told others, and by the end of February, Mara had 4 separate inquiries about whether she'd be open by spring, and 1 advance request to book the entire dining room for a ranch foreman's retirement supper. She moved the timeline up. The dining room held 8 tables when she was done arranging it. 8 plain pine tables, not matched but sturdy, with chairs she'd sourced from 2 different places and a corner bench she'd built herself from barnwood that could seat 4 more if needed. The walls were whitewashed. The floor was swept bare. There were no curtains in the Denver magazine style, no upholstered anything, none of the trappings that Dorothea Aldrich would have considered essential to the enterprise. What there was clean and warm and smelling of whatever was on the range. The first day, she served 11 people. Agnes was there, and Ruth Calloway, and 3 hands from neighboring ranches, and 2 women from the Presbyterian Ladies' Circle who had been among the people Harlan's story had reached, and who showed up, Mara suspected, partly out of curiosity and partly as a deliberate act of alignment with the side they'd chosen. The ranch foreman's retirement supper was the following Saturday. 20 people, the whole dining room and then some, tables pushed together and chairs borrowed from Agnes's spare room. It was not smooth. The first week, she burned a batch of biscuits because she'd misjudged the range's temperament at high volume. It ran hotter than her instincts expected when the firebox was fully loaded. She ran short of venison stew on the 3rd day and had to pivot to a bean and salt pork soup that she hadn't planned, which went over better than the stew probably would have, but the scramble of it stayed with her. She hired a girl named Patty Voss to help with washing up, 16 years old and willing to work for modest wages and a midday meal. And Patty broke 2 bowls in the first week and was so mortified about it that Mara had to talk her out of quitting. "They're bowls," Mara said. "They break. Go wash the others." Patty went and washed the others. The money was tight in ways that required constant vigilance. She kept a running ledger, another new habit, the ledger, and tracked every purchase and every receipt and knew at all times, within a few cents, what she had and what she owed and what the coming week would require. She paid Agnes's $40 back by July, with interest as agreed, and the look on Agnes's face when she received it was not primarily about the money. "You didn't have to be so prompt," Agnes said. "I told you I'd pay it back with interest," Mara said. "I know, I'm just saying." Agnes paused and looked at the dining room around them, the tables and the whitewashed walls, and the smell of Mara's apple cider braised pork coming from the kitchen. "I'm glad I put the $40 here." Mara thought about that for a moment. "So am I," she said. The orchard came back that first year better than expected. She'd pruned the apple trees in March, the hard, ruthless pruning that removes more than it keeps but gives the tree back its energy. And by September, the yield was modest but real. 2 varieties of apple she couldn't name but could taste. One tart and firm that kept well into winter, and one softer and sweeter that didn't keep but made extraordinary pies. The cherry trees produced almost nothing that first year, which Marsh had warned her about. Cherry trees took their time, forgiving neglect. She gave them another year. The pie became the thing people came specifically for, by October. She hadn't planned for it. She'd been making apple pie because she had apples and people wanted something sweet, and the recipe was one her grandmother had taught her before she could properly read. Standing on a stool at a kitchen counter somewhere she could no longer picture. She made the crust with lard and a little cider vinegar, and her hands, rather than any instrument, the way she'd been taught. And something in the combination of the tart apple and that particular crust produced something that was harder to replicate than it looked. She knew, because she'd watched 3 women try to write down what she did and fail to catch it. "What do you put in the crust?" Ruth Calloway asked one afternoon, sitting at the counter with a piece in front of her. "What my grandmother taught me," Mara said. "That's not a recipe." "No," Mara agreed. "It's not." Pruitt was removed from the county registrar's office in August. The territorial inspector's investigation had taken 6 months and produced findings that went considerably further than Mara's case. A pattern of coordinated deed challenges on behalf of paying clients, 3 instances of altered records, and 2 cases in which Pruitt had accepted payment to delay legitimate filings from parties he'd been instructed to disadvantage. Clara Petch's case was among them. The unnamed woman's written statement was among them. The findings were published in the Territorial Gazette, which Redstone Crossing received a week after publication. Mara read them at the pine table on a quiet Tuesday morning before the lunch service, and she thought about Clara Petch and the unnamed woman and the particular loneliness of having been cheated in a way that was too complicated to explain to people, and that nobody with power had been willing to investigate until someone pressed on it. She put the Gazette down and went to start the lunch service, because the lunch service needed starting. Harlan Aldrich did not come to the dining house. She hadn't expected him to. He had moved his business increasingly to the county seat in the months since the hearing, a shift that Gideon read as the behavior of a man managing his reputation at a careful distance from the situation that had damaged it. He was not ruined. He had too much land and too many established relationships for a single failed property maneuver to ruin him. But something had changed in how the county understood him, and he knew it, and his absence from Mara's establishment was the shape his knowledge took. Cecily came once, in September. She came on a Wednesday afternoon between the lunch and dinner service when the dining room was quiet and Mara was doing inventory in the kitchen. Patty showed her in and came to get Mara, and Mara came out and found Cecily standing in the middle of the dining room looking at it, at the tables, at the whitewashed walls, at the orchard visible through the window in the afternoon light. "It's good," Cecily said when Mara came in. "It's really good, Mara." "Sit down," Mara said. "I'll bring you coffee." She brought coffee and a piece of apple pie and sat across from Cecily at the table by the window. They didn't talk about the hearing or the deed or any of the specific events of the past year. They talked about smaller things. The summer that had just ended, the early signs of a hard winter coming, a mutual acquaintance's new baby. It was the conversation of 2 women who had a complicated history and were deciding, without discussing the decision, to be civil. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more like the acknowledgement that people could occupy the same world without the weight of the past sitting on every exchange. Mara was not sure she could give Cecily more than that. She was not sure Cecily had earned more than that, but she could give her this. When Cecily left, she said at the door, "Mother would have liked the pie." Mara looked at her for a moment. "Probably," she said. Dorothea had died in July, a swift decline from a chest illness that had started in spring. Mara had heard about it from Ruth Calloway and had sat with it for a day before deciding what she felt, which turned out to be something she didn't have a clean name for. Not grief, not satisfaction, not relief. A kind of closing, maybe. A door that had been standing open for years finally swinging shut. She'd sent a note of condolence to the Aldrich house because it was the right thing to do, and because Dorothea, whatever else she had been, was a person who had died. She hadn't expected a response. She hadn't received one. By the 2nd October, a full year from the harvest feast, from the cold porch and the tin plate and the closed door. Mara's dining house had become what Agnes had said it might, a gathering place. Not the only one in the county, not the grandest, not the place you went for ceremony, the place you went because the food was honest and the room was warm, and you felt, when you sat at one of the plain pine tables, that you were simply welcome. Not performing your welcome, not earning it, just welcome. That was harder to manufacture than people understood. Mara knew because she'd lived the alternative. She was in the kitchen on a Thursday evening in October, the year's anniversary, the dining room full behind her, when Gideon came through the kitchen door instead of the front because he'd been to the barn to check on Kel and came in the back way as he usually did when he'd been at the property. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his coat, taking in the sound of the full dining room, the smell of the range running hard, the general productive chaos of a working kitchen. "Full house," he said. "Every table," she said, without turning from the range. "There's a family from the Henderson Ranch that came all the way from the North Pasture for the pork. Ruth Calloway's here with her sister who's visiting from Casper." He came in and poured himself coffee from the pot on the back of the range, the easy familiarity of a man in a space he'd been in often enough to stop asking. She was aware of him in her kitchen the way she was always aware of him. Not intrusively, not distractingly, just as a solid presence that registered as belonging. They had not made anything formal between them. They were careful with each other in that way. Both of them people who'd been burned by commitments that came apart, who moved toward good things slowly and with full attention. There had been one evening in August when they'd sat on the porch in the summer dark, and he'd taken her hand, and they'd sat like that for a while, watching the stars come out over the orchard, and nothing had needed to be said. Things were being built between them in the same way things were being built at the farmhouse, with time and daily effort and the patience to let something become solid before you put weight on it. "Come look at something," he said, when she had a moment between the range and the serving. She followed him out the kitchen door to the back porch. It was October again, and the cold was back. The particular Wyoming cold that had been the backdrop of this whole year. The cold of the harvest feast, the cold of sitting outside with a tin plate, the cold of the farmhouse's first morning, the cold of the courthouse steps. She'd spent a year in it, and it had not gotten easier exactly, but it had become known, the way a difficult truth becomes known, something you stop flinching from because you've faced it enough times to trust your own capacity for it. Gideon was looking at the apple trees. They were bare now. November coming. The branches against the evening sky, the same dark pattern they'd been the night she arrived. But she knew what they held now. Knew the yield they'd produced this fall, knew the varieties, knew which branch on the northeast tree had a split that needed watching in the spring. She knew the land the way you know something you've spent a year attending to. "The Hendersons asked me this afternoon if you do Christmas dinners," Gideon said. She looked at him. "The family that drove from the North Pasture," he said. "The father asked me on his way out if you'd be open at Christmas. His wife wants to bring both families." She thought about it. Christmas dinner. The dining room full, the range running, the particular density of people gathered around food in the depth of winter. The work of it, which would be considerable. The money of it. The meaning of it. "How many people?" she asked. He said maybe 30. She looked at the orchard, at the bare apple trees in the cold evening air. She thought about what it is that people are really asking for when they drive from the North Pasture to eat at someone's table. Not just food. There was food closer to them than this. They were asking for the thing that good food in a warm room in the company of other people actually provides. The feeling of being in a place where someone took care, where someone made something with their hands and meant it, where you were not eating alone in the cold. She had made that place, out of a farmhouse that had been left to go to ruin, out of an inheritance that had been locked in a drawer for 15 years, out of the accumulated skill of a woman who had cooked for other people her entire life, and was now cooking for herself and anyone who came through the door. It wasn't a perfect story. It didn't have the shape of a triumph that cost nothing. There were nights she was too tired to feel the meaning of any of it, nights the ledger looked wrong and the range needed work, and Patty had quit for 2 weeks in July to help her mother, and Mara had done every dish herself. There were mornings she woke at 4 out of habit and lay in the dark and felt the old weight of 31 years of living inside someone else's definition of who she was. That didn't disappear cleanly. It receded. It became background instead of foreground. But it was there. What she had learned, What the year had ground into her through its difficulty and its small victories and its daily ordinariness was that freedom is not a single moment. It is not the hearing or the document or the leaving in the dark. Those are the opening of a door. What comes after is the steady daily work of walking through it, of building a life on the other side, of deciding each morning that the life you are building is worth the cost of building it. She had decided that. She kept deciding it. "Tell him yes," she said. "Tell him we're open at Christmas." Gideon looked at her. In the cold evening light, with the bare orchard behind him and the sound of the full dining room coming through the kitchen door, he looked like what he was. A man who had sat down on a cold porch because it seemed like the right thing to do and had not once regretted the sitting. "You sure?" he said. 30 people is a lot for one kitchen." "I know what I can do," she said. He smiled then, the rare full version of it that changed his whole face. "Yeah," he said, "you do." She went back inside. The range was running, the dining room was full. The apple trees stood bare against the cold October sky, patient as anything, waiting for spring. The woman who had eaten alone in the cold a year ago stood in her own kitchen on her own land and fed the people who came to her table, and she did not need anyone's permission for any of it. She had never needed their permission. It had just taken this long to fully understand that, to understand it not as an idea, but as a truth you carry in your body, that sits in your bones and your hands and the way you stand in a room, that no one gives you your worth, that you do not earn your place at the table by being useful enough or quiet enough or sufficiently grateful for the charity of being included. You take your place because it is yours. The door to the dining room opened and a woman called out for more coffee, and Mara picked up the pot and went to pour it. The work was not done. It never was. That was fine.